Good afternoon. Do wear a mask, please. Yesterday on Facebook I saw something which amused me. There was a pub in London with a sign outside its door saying, "All Americans must be accompanied by an adult." It tickled me anyway. And this, I think, is fairly typical of the bemusement we all feel when we're listening to conversations in the United States. Especially this great divide between the current president and the press in general. The press on the east and west coast generally, with exceptions of course, reflects a liberal point of view of the world, whereas Trump supporters reflect a strange variety of conservatism. And I'd like to try and explore this a little bit today. Now, in the 1954 film On the Waterfront, Marlon Brando's character Terry famously says, "I could have been a contender." I'm not going to try and do the accent, it's fantastic, I just make a laughing stock of myself. Now, Terry's violent world is one of widespread corruption, extortion and racketeering. And Terry had been a promising young boxer until the local mob boss made him throw a fight because he was betting against him. And although Terry wins out in the end, his character, to a certain extent, I think, represents an archetype of a certain type of American. Perhaps those who have lost out on the American dream and become frustrated and perhaps resentful. These people are the vulnerable, and there are a lot of them in the United States. And it's where President Trump finds his bedrock support. There's a psychologist called Professor Thomas Pettigrew, and he, to paraphrase him slightly, and I hope not to do him an injustice, but he's identified basically 5 traits which Trump supporters may show. The first of these is an authoritarian personality syndrome, and this often manifests itself in a belief in complete obedience to an authority. People with this syndrome display aggression to outsiders, but are submissive to authority. They resist new experiences and have a very hierarchical view of society. This syndrome, and it exists in many people, not only Trump supporters, but this syndrome is often triggered by fear. And leaders such as Trump, who tend to exaggerate threats and play on people's fear, find it easy to gain their allegiance. The second trait, which is related but different from the first, is something called social dominance orientation. And people who are orientated in this way prefer structured groups in which the high status members dominate the low status ones. these people themselves tend to be domineering, tough-minded, and driven by self-interest. And this distinction between high and low status is also fed by Trump, who talks a lot about immigrants and minorities, and makes a clear distinction between them and for example, white people. So a white person reacting to Trump's discourse can feel that he or she belongs in a high status group with reference to Mexicans, the Chinese, blacks, etc. Many people within Trump's core group tend to be prejudiced. This, I believe, is linked to the previous 2 points I've made. And there are various reasons for this, and one of them is the fourth characteristic of these people, that there is a tendency towards a lack of intergroup contact. So many of Trump's supporters have little contact with minorities. One example that was given of this was that people who are close to the border with Mexico, for example, whether Trump supporters or not, tend not to worry too much about Mexicans. But the further away you get from the border, the less Mexicans you actually know, the more in support you are of this wall that Trump is supposedly building across the border. And the last thing that a lot of these people show is a sense of relative deprivation. And people feel that they are being deprived of something to which they are entitled. And if this is the case, then this sense of frustrated entitlement can easily be taken out on the people that you think, you believe, or you are told are taking away this entitlement. And it's certainly true that conservatives and liberals tend to view the same facts in completely different ways. One group, the conservative group, might well see a threat, whereas the liberal group feels a certain amount of empathy. If you imagine, for example, immigrants, many of them illegal, crossing into California to pick fruit. It also happens here in Spain, people coming to pick fruit on the giant farms in Andalusia. Now, a conservative will see these people as a threat to perhaps jobs, or they are in fact not contributing to Social Security, or indeed they are only here because they can get money from Social Security and then their children become a burden on the state, etc., etc., etc. And a liberal might see them as very vulnerable, exploited workers who need a helping hand. Now, to an extent, the truth value of either side of this argument is not really relevant. There are cases where an equally good case could be made for both sides of the argument. But the fact that people are approaching this point in completely different ways means that they can't really have a conversation. Trump, for example, panders to his supporters by branding everything that comes out of CNN or NBC or the New York Times or the Washington Post as fake news. And it doesn't really matter to his supporters that these media can easily demonstrate that this news is not in fact fake, although it may be presented in a way that plays to the liberal agenda. But Trump supporters will believe that there is an agenda here. The wrong things are being emphasised, lies are being told. In fact, I'll give you an example with a quote from Trump that illustrates the type of discourse. He goes, and there are thousands of these. I don't want to bore you with more than one or two of them. And this is something he said before winning the election in 2016. Our country is in serious trouble. We don't have victories anymore. We used to have victories, but we don't have them. When was the last time anybody saw us beating, let's say, China in a trade deal? I beat China all the time. All the time. Notice what he's actually doing here, and it's something we'll see reflected a little later, in that he's using the language of warfare. Now, as far as I know, China and the United States are not at war, but we don't have victories anymore. We used to have victories. When did anybody last see us beating China? I beat China all the time. It's posing a complete race of people who now belong to probably the largest economy in the world as a threat to America. And this will readily be picked up by Trump's core supporters, who are showing these 5 tendencies that Professor Pettigrew identified. Now, Trump, by most counts, actually wasn't doing too badly in terms of, for example, the economy, until COVID-19 came along. And that must have come as a complete shock to Trump and his team. And the last quote that I'll give from Trump was a tweet that he issued on March the 5th, talking about the Gallup polls. And he said, Gallup just gave us the highest rating ever for the way we are handling the coronavirus situation. The April 2009-2010 swine flu, that's what he says, where nearly 13,000 people died in the US, was poorly handled. So there he's blaming somebody else, i.e. the Democrats, for 13,000 deaths. But now, as of mid-July, we are approaching 135,000 deaths in the United States. Roughly a quarter of the figure of American servicemen who died during World War II. This figure actually means that for every 100,000 American citizens, 40 have died, compared to less than 1, for example, in New Zealand. But Trump continually says that the American government, the federal government, is handling the virus well. Now, Joe Biden, his Democratic rival in the next election, has borrowed Trump's vocabulary. He's actually started to fight Trump on his own ground. And he too uses the language of war. And he said yesterday, Trump has given up and waved the white flag. Now this, I think, is directly aimed at Trump voters. They are perhaps unlikely, in any case, to switch votes from Donald Trump to Joe Biden. But what Biden is trying to do is to steal Trump's thunder. If Trump wants to talk of a war, whether it be against the virus or whether it be against China, Biden can counter that, and is countering that, using the same language, but the language of surrender. Now, this is actually quite a good tactic, because it will sow doubt in those people who are looking for an authority figure. And although those may not vote for Joe Biden, they may decide that they're aren't going to vote for Trump either. And this seems to be reflected now in the polls, where 2/3 of Americans believe that Trump is handling the virus badly, as against 33% who think he's doing okay. Of course, not all of Trump's supporters are as we perhaps imagine them to be. After all, he got just under 63 million votes in the 2016 election. Although incidentally, Hillary Clinton got nearly 66 million votes. But of course, presidents are voted in by the Electoral College, not by the popular vote. Anyway, the general point I'd like to make here, to repeat it, is that America, as I mentioned in a previous video, America is split. It's divided, and I mentioned in this other video that this division could be attributed to people who believe freedom from something is more important than the freedom to do something, or vice versa. And the end result of this is that you have two sections of American society who are talking the same language but using it in different ways, and it becomes very, very difficult for a meaningful conversation to develop. And this again will be evident whoever wins the upcoming election in November. Thank you very much for listening. Any comments, whether you think this is a load of rubbish or interesting or rambling, whatever you feel, do make a comment and I'll do my best to answer them. Okay, thank you very much.